All right, I'm not going to make you guys come up, but I will probably engage you guys. I'll probably start off by saying, like, how many folks are iGuide authors here that write profiles or implementation guides that do authoring of some sort, okay? All right, Lloyd. This one's for you, Lloyd. Thank you for coming. And I know we are a small but mighty contingent here at DevDays. I was just mentioning I chatted with a bunch of authors at lunch who are authoring using like a variety of paradigms. Some of them are authoring with their communities. And so being an author in FHIR that commonly does work on national IGs and community developed IGs, I wanted to share a little bit about some of like the process and the structure that we utilize to actually take a process that's very, I think, common for authors that use IG Publisher and bring it into the tool suite that we have. And so without further ado, kind of give you a little bit of a hint of this. So my name's Sheridan. I am a standards lead at Accenture. What that effectively just means is that I get to work with clients at a regional, at a national, at like an implementation level, and I get to help them describe their requirements in FHIR. And I think I'm very, very fortunate to get to work with folks that are at the national level that are trying to develop standards in Canada and with their constituents who are trying to develop the implementations of those standards as well. So I'm one of the authors on the base and the core and the domain profiles. So like we call the domain like use case profiles. And I get to work with clients like HL7 Canada and Canada Health Infoway on making that all kind of come together with a collaborative community of our implementers. I'm gonna actually start my timer so I don't talk. Truly, I could talk all day long about this stuff because this is what I get geeked about. Lloyd's laughing because it's really hard to consolidate this to 45 minutes. And so I've tried to really pare down the objectives for today. So my goal is to talk to you a little about like continuous integration from an IG perspective and why that is actually really meaningful, particularly if you're trying to like expose your content over time, whether that because you're writing an implementation guide or profiles at like the national or regional level, or maybe you're developing something grassroots in your community. And so, part of what I'm hoping you'll walk away with is this idea of what benefits might I get from applying a continuous integration approach to the development of my profiles and implementation guides. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about like the requirements that informed our decisions to go down this path, and like what might help you assess what types of tools you might use to kind of facilitate a similar approach. And then I'm going to actually show you kind of how this works on the stack that we have kind of been trialing over the last 4 to 6 months. Using specifically Github Simplifier, the use of packages and iGuide versioning to achieve a very similar effect of a continuous integration build of our IGs. And then I'm going to talk to you about like some of the pain points we've had and maybe put some ideas out into the universe for things that would be areas of improvement that if they sound good to you, maybe we can collaborate on. So I saw some IG authors in the crowd. Which means probably some of you guys have seen when you go on hl7.fhir.org and you're looking at an implementation guide, you might have seen like CI build in the URL before. And if you're a developer, you're thinking, yeah, I know CI build, I know CD. And that's because like in traditional DevOps and in FHIR IGs, the idea of a CI build is like a way of exposing like our code to the outside world and to show like, this is the stuff that's been approved, that has gone through some degree of QA process, that has some degree of stability in terms of like, it's gone from an idea on a page into actually being exposed for trial implementation. And it's a way of like exposing that content on a more frequent basis. One of the reasons I think in FHIR IGs and in the FHIR standard space, we really like to do this is because it provides us this insight very, very early on, like it tells the market, it tells the implementers, this is where we're moving. You might not be on these working group calls where we're discussing and making decisions, but you have an artifact that tells you, this is current state, this is our current state of thinking, this is what you should react to and tell us if we're wrong. And so it really allows for that interaction ahead of formal releases so that we can bake your feedback in much, much earlier in the process and engage you asynchronously. I also think CI builds are really helpful for multi-author teams. It's something that I end up typically working on where we might be working in a particular domain like patient summary, and we have a number of FHIR iGuide authors because there's a breadth of content. And you might have some folks that are working on like, I'm gonna call it like a feature, like a change for a particular use case. and others that might be reacting to like reconciliation of feedback from a ballot. And so CI builds and like branching in general is something that actually allows for us to facilitate that quite well. So I hinted at this a little bit. So in FHIR, many of our IGs, particularly ones that are developed in kind of this, you probably saw that virtuous cycle or the standards development process. We develop them through like convening and developing consensus with our stakeholders in a kind of structure called working groups. And what that means is that like if you're a developer and you're used to like your team making decisions on codes, it's an expansion of that process to say, implementers, we have this problem statement, we want to make an expectation of how that might be implemented, and actually allows for those decisions to be governed by the group as a whole. I mean, that's really, really important from the standpoint of like consensus driving decision making and feedback driving decision making. What I will say is oftentimes in the kind of FHIR implementation guide development process, particularly in the national and the international space, major and minor releases, they mean something. It's more than just like, okay, I fixed this bug or I've added a new feature. Oftentimes our major and minor releases have to do with like regulation and what we're going to expect folks to actually implement and we're going to require and apply a financial incentive towards. Which means that we need a lot of exposure and a lot of testing, and a lot of balloting, like a lot of points of contact with our community before we might say, that's a release 1, that's a release 2. And while we're going through this kind of process, a lot of times what we also see is like our working group keeps meeting, right? Because we have these engaged subject matter expertise. Lloyd did a talk earlier this morning about like how hard it is to keep folks like the momentum going. And so a lot of times the way we do that, even while we're in the process of like, you know, kind of freezing content in the guide, is that we keep meeting and talking through use cases and developing content and principles and requirements. So all of this kind of contributes to this idea that like you may actually have to need multiple states of your given guide at any given time. Other important component, oftentimes when we do make a release for a FHIR implementation guide, or even if we're making a release of just profiles, that's often accompanied by an artifact called a FHIR package, a TGZ file, which is effectively like, this is the snapshot in time. It doesn't always have to be tied to releases. Oftentimes we use it in test-driven development outside of a major or minor release to like load into a testing tool. But it is a really core component of what this process looks like. And so taking that all together, what we've been able to do when we incorporate this kind of CI build like philosophy is that we're actually able to say, this is what we know about what the working group has said at this point in time, and that it allows for us to kind of expose those codes and decisions to a much broader kind of ecosystem of implementer partners so that they can react. Particularly important, you probably have been hearing about national standards programs. I'll say that not everything that we talk about is, like, I would say it's generalizable well beyond the development of a national implementation guide or national profiles. But oftentimes this big lead up to release is very common in national standards programs. And so you might see like a full year that it takes to initially get your requirements, then start to put it and implement it, translate it into FHIR, and then a period of 4 to 6 months where you're telling your community, okay, react to this before you put it out for formal ballot. And this is a process that we're seeing show up in Australia, we're seeing show up in the US, in some of our domain-based guides in Canada, like patient summary. We had this kind of 12 to 14 month period cycle as well. And so we don't want to just say, oh, we're going to hole up and work on those requirements in our basements. We want to show people as it's getting developed, the work that's occurring, so they have this ability to react often and react easily. Okay, so the main idea behind, I would say, any specification that you're developing collaboratively is that you're probably following some form of the collaborative standards development lifecycle. And so I would describe this as, you have a subject area, maybe a set of use cases, a set of problems that you're trying to solve. You're going to bring this to your community. In our case, it's a working group. They're going to have discussions, they're going to make decisions, and that those decisions are going to then be kind of catalyzed in the form of a change to a FHIR profile or change to a guide page. At some point in time, regardless of whether or not you're doing a CI build, it's going to be applied in your specification. You're then going to say, okay, team, like, are we ready? Or is this the time that we're going to put a release out into the world? And you're actually just going to go and do it, right? You're going to, after you've gotten that consensus, you've decided enough for a period of time, you're going to release your implementation guide, subsequent FHIR packages. And you could do that for like a variety of different purposes. You could be doing it just to get feedback, right? You could be putting it out into the world for, in our case, like a trial ballot, okay? Broader set of stakeholders that maybe haven't been at the working groups on a week-to-week basis. Here is a snapshot in time, tell us what you think. And the feedback that comes out of that feeds right back into that development maintenance lifecycle, right? Like what people say goes back to the working groups to say, okay, how do we want to respond to this? What actions do we want to make? You can also make a release that is oriented around testing. And that could be like informal testing, like did a change that we make our examples non-conformant, but it could also be formal testing, right? So you could be doing a package release for the purpose of supporting like beta testing or projectathon or connectathon. And understandably, that's also another avenue for feedback. And so we kind of follow this continuous cycle, but the degree in which we kind of put out content usually changes based on the capacity that you have. And so I would say that like when we started thinking about what we were really successful at doing within a lot of our kind of national implementation guides, a big part of that was like trying to build up the amount of asynchronous feedback that we were receiving, right? We have an amazing group of people that show up week to week on our working groups, but we also know that like sometimes someone will log in every 3 months, look at the guide and want to tell us something. And it's really hard for them to do that meaningfully if all of our decisions are captured in like a decision log in Word on our Confluence page, but not showing up in the guide. So they can't really, it's very abstract. It's hard to actually react to that. So that's the promise of a continuous integration build for us, right? You get this benefit of early exposure, kind of constant iterative development, which is like incredibly necessary when your content is early in its maturity, and even more necessary when it's a community developed guide. I think everybody, I thought I was the cool one for using a meme in my presentation, and then I realized everybody at DevDays does that. But really, the takeaway should be that when you're developing content, it's feedback, 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 and that can feel sometimes overwhelming. But if it's overwhelming, it means that you're probably doing it right because people are talking to you. So when we thought about, okay, how are we going to deal with this? Like more feedback, we said, okay, what requirements, what considerations should we have in play? Because, as part of our overall tooling stack, we wanted to make sure that we were able to kind of maximize the features that we had available to us and like maybe push in some areas and figure out ways of achieving some of our requirements on like the development and the exposure space if we could. And so key things that we were really honed in on, and so like if you have similar requirements, this might be helpful to you. We wanted separation of like spaces, separation of branches, and ways that we could easily tell what the delta was going to be between them, right? Like a huge part of really any standards development process, but also community standards development, is being able to say, this is what changed over time, here's why it changed, and there's a really clear story there. And so being able to say, okay, we can take off versions at a time, put them in separate branches. We can show you, this is the version of the things that we've talked about and agreed to. These are the things that we're working on or maybe still kind of have some rough edges, was really, really key. The other thing that is really, really critical for us was the ability to support multiple authors. So Daniel, I don't know how you did it, because you said earlier this morning that you seem to be like an author in so many spaces, but I only have so many hours of the day. And so until I figure out cloning, a lot of the times when we're working, particularly in community developed guides, is we have larger teams, but we also ask our community to contribute, right? And I think that's ultimately like a amazing asset to the sustainability of any implementation guide, is like having people who are engaged enough to you to say, oh, I was the one that put in that ticket. Let me put in the pull request to actually, after we've agreed that that's how we want to make the change, like I'll go and do that. I think that's a really good indicator that you're kind of in this success phase. but it also means you need a process that keeps up with that. And it may mean that you have potentially authors that are working in their own comfort zones. So some might be writing in Excel, others might be writing in JSON, others are in many, many more, others are writing in Fish, some are using UIs to do this, and we wanted our process to reflect that. It doesn't reflect that entirely, but we're working on it. We knew that like validation was gonna be key. We are exposing our content to the outside world. We wanted it to be transparent, but we also wanted to show a clean face. And so having something incorporated into this to make sure that the minute it goes into the guide, like it's going to be valid, it's gonna be QA'd, was really, really important because we didn't wanna break our guide or break our profiles that we were exposing and ultimately like erode the trust that we built in these spaces. So I would say our requirements were very much both development and exposure focused. So I talked about change, transparency being really important. And part of that means, does my set of tools allow me to like look at my commit logs and see over time, like this is how changes were made, here's what the delta is, here's the tie-in to like that ticket that came in from a community working group discussion. And we also needed to package frequently without noise. I think at some point in the deck I say like ad nauseum, and that's the truth. Like we package a lot because we test a lot. So we came to the conclusion based on our requirements and based on some considerations and like around exposure to take a kind of best of breed approach, which technically meant it was a little bit more challenging for us because a lot of the things that are incorporated into a CI build are an automatic part of the process if you're publishing through IG Publisher. But we have something called the Canadian FHIR registry in Canada where all of our implementation guides are hosted and easily findable. And so that kind of influenced this in terms of like considerations for like where we might host our iGuide that drove us to kind of look into ways to simulate or create this process using our own tooling suite. So there's a couple components. So we've got like, where do we host the iGuide? And for many of you, like these components may actually be facilitated by the same tool. That's totally fine. We also have a file repository, so that's like our source of truth. That's where everything lives, regardless of where the iGuide lives. We have our authoring tool, so how are you actually writing the profiles? How are you actually writing the guides? A component for validation and a component for actually capturing what our community members were saying and what they wanted, which is like our issue log. So key point here, if it's not totally clear already, a big degree of our choice of setting up a CI build this way was driven by the fact that we were using simplifier.net for hosting in the Canadian FHIR registry, because it meant we could expose it to other guides that were tagged, this is a Canadian guide, and that Canadian authors and folks that were new to implementing, like they have one place to go and they can just find it very easily. We also found that our ability to kind of package very quickly, package as much as we need, and sometimes unlist packages. So if we made a mistake, be able to kind of at least have that be viewable to only a select group of people was really important. We were doing a lot of load this into the Inferno testing tool. Oh, does it not work? Okay, let's make another package, make the fix, and try again. And to that point, also around page development, we found that it was a little bit of an easier point of entry. I love IGP, don't kick me out, but it is sometimes a little bit overwhelming for authors that are writing, that are business writers, and they're just going into the guide to say, this is what we need for the section. And we found, while both are markdown, the actual interface for capturing that information was a little bit easier. So our source of truth, we use GitHub. Allows for multi-author environments. It allows us to do staging, right? So it lets us do all that QA. It lets us do the reviews before it goes back to the mothership. And it lets us do branching really well. So there is I'll show you guys in a minute, there's a sample IG that you can pull down that so that your source of truth, if you want to follow this process, looks very similar. It might look a little bit different if you're using the fish approach, but I have the link in the guide as well. Tooling, I would say this is dealer's choice. So I didn't include Excel sheets on this one, but whether or not you're producing the structure definitions in Forge or Fish or JSON, the intent is for our process that you could author in any of those means. The validation piece, right, that just allows for us to apply a quality control. And we actually decided to use IG Publisher because it provides, like, especially for those of us that were like already using the structure for authoring, like a much lighter lift to do validation. And while there is validation capabilities in Simplifier, it's like after you import it. So like it kind of didn't necessarily help us because we needed to actually stage it away from the public before we figured out, yes, there's nothing wrong with this, bring it into the main view. And then our community issue log. This is probably the least, like the piece that's least integrated to the process, but it is really, really important to touch on because like oftentimes as part of our overall, make this change, incorporate it into the CI build, like we're referencing the actual change request IDs wherever possible. I know I'm not the best at it, but we are trying because it does help us tell that story of why we made the change, when we made it, and what it was tied to. Okay, now the interesting stuff, high-level structure. So you can see, like, if you are syncing your GitHub repository with like a Simplifier project, there's going to be like one point of linkage. So you can have multiple branches in your GitHub repository, but I like to think of Simplifier as like really only having one branch if you want to stay sane right now. So you might have multiple branches, but you're going to have one that's the nominated one for like the files that are going to be synced between the two. And when I say sync it, it's one directional, right? So it's like you make the change in GitHub, shows up in a millisecond in Simplifier. Right now, our text files are not synced. Like we've kind of played around with, can we do this with our Markdown files as well? That would be great. That would be great. I have a list. Right now, it's not synced, and it's largely, I think, due to like the way that files are assessed for uniqueness and duplication that I'll touch on in a second. Other components, we talked about packaging. So we package around like exposing packages to the outside world, usually around like major releases. Sometimes around minor releases. And there's an interesting component of like this new editable implementation guide in that like you typically have like a master version that's like your writable one. In Simplifier, you might be able to like, you can attach it to like your CI build, which is your profiles at any given point in time, or you can attach it to this is a package. You're also now able to like publish the like a release version 1.0 of my guide. And even though that's editable, because essentially you have only one project to work in, there is some challenges here because what ultimately ends up happening is, let's say you put out a ballot release for someone to react to, and then you did a bunch of work in a new feature, and you updated the implementation guide pages. There's no way to like isolate those changes from the implementation guide pages. And so you can't like revert them easily back and forth. So we typically said, okay, if we're going to be doing like any dev between ballot freeze and exposure to ballot dispositioning, we're going to keep that in like the dev branches of our GitHub repo, so that like, and we're not going to do any like pre-development in the implementation guide pages because it creates some challenges when you're trying to say like only this stuff was what was balloted. This is another view of that. I wanted to point out, we actually had a conversation about this at lunch. So, this is the integration between like the GitHub repo, the actual Simplifier project. Some of the processes when you package are going to be like automatic. So every time you package, you're going to have to, or you will have your package contributed to the FHIR package registry. But there's a manual process if you want your implementation guide listed on the IG registry. So into like, I think it's igregistry.com, I can't remember. There's another file from a GitHub project called IG registry that you can clone and put in a pull request for to then say, oh, I've just put up PSCA 1.0. We were talking about it at lunch. I thought it was going to be nice for it to be automatic, but the amount of times that we actually package, it actually makes sense that there's a little bit of control here where you might only want to expose like major and minor versions, but not like feature additions over time, because it is a manual step. Okay, sorry, I talk a lot. Okay, if you are using this process the way we did, IG Publisher is involved, mostly for its validation capabilities, but it also means that you're gonna have to install some of its dependencies to make this run. You're only gonna use it like kind of like a shell, but you do need those dependencies to run the shell. So there's actually some great documentation now. I feel like it's improved a lot over the years that will tell you like, here's how you get Java, here's how you get Jekyll, Ruby, all of the things that are required. And then you take a sample IG from one of the HL7 repositories, and you're good to go. So the 4, or I guess 5 main steps is going to be initiation, so set up your environments, linkage, so you're going to link your environments. Magic happens in between. You get people to agree. They agree on changes, and then you can make those changes locally. QA, and actually then committing it into a dev branch and bringing it back into the main. So I'm just going to actually tell you guys how we did this in the actual files, because that's how I consume information. So this was the example of the GitHub repos that you can copy if you want to start in Implementation Guide Publisher. The first one is if you are like writing manually in JSON or XML. The second one is fish. There's other fish examples, but I like this one because it already has the description of how you link your fish project in GitHub to Simplifier, so it's like a little bit of a shortcut. It'll just basically say, here's all the folders that you need. Because you're using IG Publisher kind of like a shell, there's a few key files and folders that you really care about. There are some that you really don't, but you still need to maintain. So things like the git ignore, which I'll talk about in a second, the IGNI, and some of like your inputs are going to be the things that you actually spend time editing in. And for us, we just said, okay, great, data, images source, we aren't touching that, but we're also not deleting it. So if you're going to follow the similar process, your git ignore file, which is essentially saying, what are the things that you might want to have working on your computer locally, like the actual files to run the publisher that update frequently over time, that you don't necessarily want to write and commit every single time you make a commit to your GitHub. So that's what your git ignore is for. It identifies the things that you want locally, but you don't care to kind of continuously persist and update. The shell and bat files are a great example of that, because chances are you are following best practices, you're frequently updating your publisher, and these are frequently changing. So there's no purpose to push them up. The IGNI, if you're just using it as a placeholder or like a shell, you shouldn't really have to change your the name of your iGuide file. I think it starts out by default, myig.xml. Your IGNI file basically just says this is the location of where publisher has to look within the input folder to find that, your implementation guide file. So mine was called placeholder IG, very original. So I actually stripped mine down so that I only had like the minimal information that was necessary. It'll provide you this is a fully baked file that has examples, yada, 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 but I wanted to use the structure and only keep what I needed. So you do have to manually add dependencies. So there's some minimal meta information that is necessary to run IGP. So you have to set your canonical, you have to identify if you base on AU core, or you base on IPS, or you base on CA core, you want, and your profiles, when you run them through and validate them, want to leverage that content to create the snapshot. You have to name it in your placeholder IG. You have to also nominate it a little bit later that I'll talk about, but this is what's going to give you that fulsome cross-project validation if you are trying to leverage the work that's in other profiles to drive harmonization. Not everything in the actual guide structure and resources need to actually be named. So I've commented out a lot of that in my placeholder IG. Really important, this is like an alternative flow note that I'm just going to raise. Many of us don't start with our projects knowing we're going to do the CI build process. And so if you're like me and my team, and you had your profiles and your content loaded into Simplifier before you decided to take on CI build, it's going to be really important before you take the next step, which is to set up the link, to look at your file paths and ultimately change them to reflect the resource folders that are in there. And that's because when you manually upload a file, you're already transversing into the folder, you're selecting it. And that's why you see appointment, structure definition, that's the name of the file. But when you are pulling from GitHub, it's considering the subfolders to be part of that name. And so I think this is a good feature because it prevents overwriting things that you don't want to overwrite, but Simplifier will consider it a duplicate. And if you're like us, you'll be paralleling your hair out because it will create duplicates of all of your profiles that you then have to revert. day or two before ballot, which is not fun. Yeah. So take the step right before you link it, otherwise you will be sorry. Next step in the process is actually performing that linkage. So I would actually say that the UI makes this fairly straightforward. I will note this is like because we're part of the Canadian FHIR registry, we have a license, and so the GitHub link is part of that licensure. But it's literally you select GitHub, link your repository. It does this process through webhooks. I think there was an SSO when we first did this that like allowed for me to identify myself in GitHub because it knows like every one of my repositories that I can select from. I was setting it up for an organization that I am a writer on, but not an admin. So we had to do a little bit of funkiness in terms of like generating the webhook manually. But if you have admin privileges on your GitHub repository, you should be able to just say new webhook created by Simplifier and have that flow through nice and easy. I also recommend not deleting things that are deleted in your implementation guide in Simplifier, solely for the purpose of, there's a chance that, I don't know if you would do this naturally, but as you progress further in maturity and things aren't being used, we want to retire them, right? We don't want to just delete them from the face of the earth and have our implementers go, what? Like, what happened to that device profile that I now have baked into my system? So we want to reduce the opportunity for that to slip through. And so like, even if that were to slip through, we would make the decision to like apply a retired status as opposed to just like wiping it off the face of the earth. So I always select do not delete. Okay, the next piece is gonna be, it's related to your settings, right? And that's just gonna be like a second step around inclusion. So there's some things that you aren't gonna like necessarily push up back and forth into GitHub, your local build into GitHub. There's also some things like the folders that we talked about that are just like for running the process, not necessarily like anything more than a shell. You probably don't want filtering over into your Simplifier project. So there is a default. We've modified it slightly because for our project, we were just starting with our resources. We will kind of eventually do this with our examples. But you can just name like, I don't want anything in the output folder. I don't want anything, or I guess for us, it would be like the input examples subfolder or the input images source folders. So it's fairly straightforward. It just means like anything that you don't anticipate will live as a file in your project. Important setting. All right, last piece is your dependencies. So I don't know, and I want to check if there's a way of doing this, but effectively, like, while you do have to manually add your dependency into your placeholder IG file, your XML file, to like get a really decent look at the QA, you also need dependencies when you package. And so if that doesn't get ported over, I don't believe it does at this point, then you have to like nominate them in the UI. And so you can do this by just going to the dependencies tab, adding the dependencies that your profiles have. So maybe they're dependent on your national baseline or core. Maybe they're dependent on another e-referral guide because you're driving harmonization. Just don't forget this step. Otherwise, you're going to get an error that says so-and-so couldn't resolve in your profile. Another note before we go into the phase where we talk about like actual like the editing. So there are, particularly if you're working in a community developed guide, which I hope that you guys start thinking about, additional repo settings in GitHub that can be helpful, like for managing the fact that you may have maybe some staffed or semi-staffed authors and some community members that are very active in like wanting to put in pull requests. So while it's maybe not a default, you can apply settings that like specifically require approvals and that will allow, you can have another setting that will allow for your primary authors to like get around the approval that's necessary for a pull request, because sometimes you don't have like a secondary reviewer to say, yep, that makes sense, and you have to like be able to push through changes quickly. Ideally, you always have a second reviewer, but it's one of those options that you have. Allow rebase merging, especially if you're like working on multiple dev branches that like maybe different features. This is going to kind of allow for your authors to kind of stay in sync with what's going to be in the CI build over time, something to consider, so that they don't have to then like figure out what the delta is and like reapply it. The magic happens. You convene your working group. So let's say you've done like up until this point, you've done all of your setup. You've got everything working so that your environments work. You're set up to have multiple authors, and ultimately you've got this project that's ready to make changes. So you continue your working group, you capture, maybe you have them vote on how they feel about a change to profile or a change to a value set. You apply that change. I chose a really easy one, which is just like maybe you add in a certain set of values to your value set. And then ultimately, you're going to be doing this locally. So you're going to be doing it in that like that first view that I saw, that it was like input, resources. That's where you make that initial change. You're going to use IG Publisher by like, I still use Gen once for some reason. So after you make that change, you save it. You run IG Publisher by clicking Gen once. You look at what the QA file says in the output folder. So that's qa.html. And then you have a really nice human readable view of what hopefully you didn't do wrong. And after you're very confident and your editors are very confident that it is running without error or warning, then you progress it in a commit to the dev branch, or whatever you might name it after a feature, and put in a pull request into the main. So this was an example of one that we had like a secondary reviewer on that was reviewing from a refinement cycle and pushing it into the actual CI build. And magically, as soon as the actual commit and the pull request is merged, you'll see an update in your log, which just says this was done automatically through this help desk thing from the GitHub repository. How am I doing on time? Else? Good? 3 minutes to end? Oh, Q&A. OK, awesome. OK. OK, so lessons learned. A lot. We're still like this. We've just started implementing this in January, so we're still learning quite a lot about what works and what doesn't. What I will say is that no matter what, when you choose to like apply changes, you always have to consider like capacity, right? So choosing like, while we say continuous integration, the likelihood is that you probably will kind of treat this more like sprints that every once in a while you keep up to date. So while we had like our working group that was meeting on a biweekly basis, like many of our editing team was like working on 3 to 4 different iGuides at the same time. So like we had to make sure that our community knew like you might make that change, but you may not see it for like another week or two because we're trying to do everything at once, and we're trying to make sure that like we are giving it the proper QA. And so typically it took about a month, even though the actual effort to like make some of these edits was minimal and the effort to QA them. We still needed to think about like staffing plans and resourcing and the spread of the various kind of life cycles we were in. But we did end up getting kind of 3 refinements out in between like the January period until our content freeze in March. And so that was 3 new opportunities for folks in the larger community to say, you know what, actually, I've looked at this, I've tested this, and this doesn't maybe make sense for me before you go into the strenuous process of balloting, which was great for us. But it was, rooted in pragmatism. I think this is obvious. Like, I think if you're going to apply this process and you're going to like have a source of truth, use your source of truth. Make sure your authors are using IG Publisher to do QA. Ideally, you have stops in place to make sure that, if you miss a step in the process, like, or you have human error, you're still going to be okay. But, learn from us and like maybe sit down with your team, especially if you have like a wide editor team, and say, this is what we're going to follow. We're going to make sure that we're like every single commit, we're going to put our change request ID in to make sure that you have consistency across the team. The other piece I think I already talked to, which is make sure you do the alternative flow. If you have already loaded your profiles into Simplifier, don't do this maybe at a time that's super mission critical. Maybe do this at like a lull time so that like you just reduce the pressure a little bit. You allow for your team to get used to the process. And then the other thing I would say is like we're still figuring out how this works within like the ballot context. So we might still be meeting and talking about like a new use case. But for the most part, because we want to ensure that, like, particularly our guide environment, we have the changes that are like explicitly have been exposed in ballot are the ones that we're working on changing first and like showing that over time and not commingling it with new stuff that like hasn't been community approved. We've basically said, listen, the lesson learned here is keep that in the dev branch. You can keep working on it, showing progress, but don't bring it back into your Simplifier like exposure point. Until you're through reconciliation. What could be improved? Okay, this was my wish list. Maybe some of these things would be helpful outside of this process or within it. I would really love if we could have alternate branches of the guide, because that might allow, like that's more, I think, equivalent to what we see in the IGP space. And it lets you say, okay, I'm making this edit of an iGuide page for this particular use case, and I can easily merge that into the main later on. I think this was like maybe one of the more hokey aspects of the process, but it's also, we make more changes to our profiles than our guide pages for some of our kind of mid-maturity guides. It might be different in early maturity. Someone please help me figure out how we can allow for fish-generated files to be incorporated under JSON authored content. I had conversations with some very smart people at lunch, and we still could not figure out how to make this work. Many of our authors still write in JSON and like can pick up fish, but like a huge surge in the community, obviously, especially our community editors, has picked this up, and it would be nice if our tooling environments worked to support that collaboration. But I am not an infrastructure person, so maybe, Lloyd, that's a wish list for you. We'll see. We can talk. Or if you have ideas, please come up to me. It'd be really nice to be able to like do the thing that we do when, let's say, yesterday I saw a presentation that was like the CI build of the extension registry. You can just say like, this point in time, pull down what's in my cache, I'm using that. Unless we package, we can't really add it as like a dependency or like incorporate it into testing. So that would be also more of a nice to have, but would make this easier, particularly as you're trying to do more test-driven development and like load things like this into like your FHIR validator or your Inferno test suite and throw examples against it. We talked about package manual registration. After lunch, I'm thinking maybe this actually doesn't necessarily need to be improved. And then I would love if we could have our GitHub actually have some form of integration into our Jira so that like you don't have that opportunity of missing like this was a change that was for this, or even like saying this happened for this, and this issue, and like maybe not having that actually be the full scope of the changes that were made. It happens. We were all very busy. So I hope this is helpful. I hope that it at least gave you considerations, regardless of your tooling suite, for why you should consider continuous integration in your own collaborative standards development process. I'm hopeful if you are using Simplifier like we are, that it gives you insight into how you can replicate this in your stack. And that maybe we could form a collective of folks that want some of those items in my wish list. If there's enough folks, usually it gets done. If you want to reach out to me, there's my contact information. I will say, like, we talked and I showed examples of how we've done this in Canadian specs. There's an amazing, incredible team. And if you have questions about like our e-referral spec or any of our others, you can reach us at standards@info.ca or talk to Anil and he will put you in contact with the right person. Or Tarek. Tarek's in the room too. I'm like looking else. So yeah, any questions?
I saw that you were tracking your changes through Jira tickets. Do you have any kind of changelog or history directly in the IG so that someone that pulls down the latest, they can see what just changed between your builds?
So, so we talked about Jira tickets. I think what you're describing is like, can I see the delta between files? Okay, so there is, I actually use it quite a bit. It's like a history tab in Simplifier, and it lets you compare versions over time. You don't get the context of, here is the commit information, but like I often will use it to say like, oh, we put out a release on this date. Can you show me what the delta is from that to where I am? So in that sense, like there's not flow through, but if what you really care about is like file comparison and change comparison in your profiles, the history tab will do that. I should have put that on my wish list. I really want that for the guides too, because that's really important and it has stumped us in the past.
Yeah, it's part of it that in Simplifier, but for anyone else, it's going to be working directly with the strategy.
Yeah.
To see part of that history and the changes.
Yeah, yeah, and right now I would say like it's manual pieces, but we are like we are evolving the process as we go. So hopefully we'll have something that is a little bit maybe more integrated with our tooling suite over time. We're also like really dedicated to putting our changelog like page in the guide and saying like this is explicitly what changed. So it's a human readable version. I know that's probably not what you want to hear, but
no, that's fine. But that,
yeah.
That's where that manual update. Okay.
Yep.
So I have a question and a comment. So my comment on the change content is I was talking with Graham the other day, and he was telling me that there's a parameter you should be able to set in your IG that it's going to do a comparison between your last released snapshot, and it will add that like colouring and indicate what is added and deleted and so forth automatically. And I'm absolutely looking to take advantage of that. I need to remember to message Graham and tell me which parameter that is so we can set that in AU Core. My question was terminology. How are you managing terminology and what your integration is? Is that all in your iGuides, or do you develop your terminology in different spaces, and how is that integrated in a continuous integration build?
Yeah, so the example I actually showed you was it was a messaging-based implementation guide. So there are some explicit cases where we might actually develop a defined value set that isn't like SNOMED CTCA or PCL, PCLOT, that's what I'm gonna say. Some of our considerations, particularly in the messaging space, is we were looking at the guide that I showed as an example, trying to harmonize some of the implementation that had already occurred in some of the regions that we had. So we had some like value sets that we had to kind of maintain over time. In other national guides like PSCA, one of the things that we're trying to do, that we've done in the interim is like created kind of this is the definition. We may not explicitly say, and this is an interim piece, you know, this is the resolvable URL in our terminology server, but that is going to change. So we take a stance that we want to make sure anything that we're publishing at the kind of national and domain-based level, we are kind of working with our national release team, working with the terminologists that like are part of our communities to say, you know, here is the descendant that we think might make sense for this value set, and having that eventually hosted on a terminology server.
Which I guess is a follow-up for me. So for your terminology server, are your terminology resources, like your value sets, actually published in your iGuides, or are they published separately and then loaded into your terminology servers through that process by your terminology team?
I think that's a TBD because we're literally in the process of migrating. But if you do have further questions on what that looks like, Neil and Tarek are in the room.
All right, this is going to be the last one because we're already over time, I think.
Yeah, thanks for the great talk. How are you dealing with that situation that you have like a lot of like alpha, beta published implementation guides and also resources for that the implementers are using then the correct versions and are not like in confused state which one to pull, which one to use, which one to test basically?
Yeah, so one of the things that we've been doing actually is kind of creating like a table in the homepage of our project and saying like, this was the release, this is kind of the status of the release, here's context around what you should be utilizing. And that sounds like a really kind of human answer, but I mean, to be honest, like it catches a lot of things in that sense. In a lot of the guides that we're developing, you know, we put them out in the last year or two, they're very early on in their development, and we told folks up front, we're gonna take this to the point of like, draft, we're gonna take it through Connectathon. When we put this out for trial implementation, that's when you start to have to focus on incorporating into your product and so forth, and like working on what your migration plan will look like over time. So from an iGuide perspective, like, you know, there are a bunch of different touch points in your implementation guide that help. We started using iGuide versioning within Simplifier to basically say, we're always going to use the same URL now, rather than being like, this one has a versioned URL that like lives in the internet somewhere we can't find again. That kind of helps for people to kind of see the progression over time. And then working with our implementer community to say like, hey, we're working on doing this new use case next. We want to start developing this, taking that through our testing process and encouraging their implementation of it. So it's not like, there was actually a great talk on like this kind of dark launch, I think is what they called it, which is, you know, how do I implement a package and like into my environment and see what the changes are before I kind of fully put that into my code. And I think I'm really interested in that on the implementer side. And on the author side, the best that we can do is like communicate and point implementers in the right direction for options they might choose. I don't know, is that very satisfying or unsatisfying? We'll talk. I'll listen if you have ideas.
Thanks, Sheridan.